Sarah, in trying to understand the real fundamentals of religion, one approach is philosophical. And there are various traditions. There's an analytic tradition that very carefully describes arguments. And then there's a phenomenological tradition, traditionally called continental, which deals with more unified concepts. Are both of these good approaches to understand the deep antecedents of religion about God, if there is a God?
Well, I am personally passionately convinced that these two strands should not be seen as at enmity with one another. After all, they're very recent cousins. The continental tradition in philosophy, so-called, only goes back to the beginning of the 20th century when it departed from the analytic. They both have antecedents in modern philosophy, especially in the Kantian tradition. And I think they both have strengths. They're complementary strengths. I am personally primarily committed to the analytic tradition because I think its great ability to clarify and probe and refuse to be to allow just Kant to dominate, but constantly to ask for clarification, is a huge asset, and it's an apologetic necessity in a secular world. But at the same time, I think it has immense blind spots, and it does very badly with more complicated hermeneutical questions of interpretation of texts.
So let's look at both sides of that. What are the benefits of the philosophy of religion for theology?
Theology does very badly, in my view, unless it has a philosophical branch. This is a contentious position. There are many theologians who think that we are besmirching theology when we attempt to clarify things philosophically,
Yes.
that we are selling out to a culture that may be antagonistic. But I take it to be an absolutely indispensable urge within the theological undertaking to be responsible for clarifying the truth statements that one is attempting to make, and to abandon that commitment is to abandon, I think, seriousness about one's own position.
Yeah, I like to say that philosophy can help you understand where the limits of rationality are and where you have to make the leap of faith. And there's nothing wrong with making the leap of faith as long as you know what you're doing at each moment.
Yes, of course, there are different views about where that leap comes and whether it necessarily is a leap. And it's my perspective that to make a disjunction between what is rational and then what is somehow trans-rational or perhaps even irrational and embraces the realm of faith, which, by the way, rather few philosophers actually have held, is a mistake. Rather, I see rationality as itself, as it were, labile and open and transforming itself even as one pushes back further into arenas of mystery.
And would the continental phenomenological philosophy of theology help in that regard?
It tends to be more amenable to that idea. But actually, I think there are strands within the analytic tradition, especially now, because analytic philosophy in its secular mode is changing very dramatically and has given up long ago the logical positivist view that anything that goes beyond sort of perfectly ordinary speech is just meaningless. Therefore, analytic philosophy is also very helpful in this realm. And indeed, I mean, some of the most interesting developments in contemporary philosophy, secular philosophy, are involving the analytic tradition re-examining itself and wondering whether it needs to develop new forms. And many of such philosophers call themselves post-analytic now.
What about the other side? What about the areas of philosophy, analytic and continental, that are detrimental, that don't work with theology, that have a clash?
I like clashes. I think clashes are important.
That's why I'm talking to you.
Yeah. I think there's nothing more important than being challenged in one's faith. I don't mind a bit if someone tells me that I'm being irrational or meaningless in what I say about God, because I think I have to give an account of myself. It's part of my responsibility, not just as a theologian, but as a Christian in general. So the more that there is genuine, questing, critical debate, the better I like it. I think the danger that Christians will retire into rather lazy arenas of sectarian self-congratulation is always to the disadvantage of the faith, ultimately.
No, I agree. But are there areas of philosophy that are wrong, that are negative, that are truly detrimental and destructive of theology?
Absolutely. I think the prevalent reductive physicalism of much contemporary science clearly is incompatible with belief in an afterlife, belief in a certain kind of freedom, and therefore undermining to belief in God itself. So one has to go out to battle. There are the sort of defeating the defeaters arguments that have to be had by theologians.
And do you welcome those?
I absolutely do. How else can one have a quest for truth? I wouldn't do that in the middle of a church service, probably, although I think priests constantly underestimate the intelligence and lively critical thinking of their laity. And I've never been told off by my congregants for bringing theology into my sermons. They seem to appreciate it.